Well, next I'd like you to continue the theme of not entirely thinking about buildings in a city, but now start to think about the layers that make up a city. In fact, think about before the city was there. What was there before the city? Well, probably very little. Probably just the natural. So we may have had natural features like a river. We probably just had farmland. And in some places we probably had hills versus flat cities, and that will have an impact on how a city feels. But ignoring that and purely looking at, let's assume this is a clean, flat, natural environment with one river, we probably had some early human features that appeared that stayed there for a long time. So the Romans may have found the crossing point on the river, which eventually became a bridge. And to that bridge, you probably had a main road eventually that connected, and then other roads that connected to that. So you get a layer which is the streets in a place. And in those streets, you'll have all the services, water, gas, power, and such like. So once they're there, they're really difficult to move. And between those streets, you have blocks of land. And in those blocks of land, you have ownership plots. These red areas here that will vary by location, and you may have one where the plot is the same as the block, or the block may be split up into different plots. And then sat within that, you will have the buildings, essentially floating as a layer again. That situation exists in pretty much any urban environment. This is somewhere which is probably akin to the New York situation of streets that are all 90 degrees to one another, the buildings the same distance from the street. Here's a location which is probably similar to a 1960s development. Big slab buildings, streets that don't really go particularly anywhere. There's really an obvious connection missing there. And they're actually very similar buildings to these, but that street structure means that it feels different as a place. And that's not the building layer, because those buildings, that and that, pretty much interchangeable. But we have a layer beneath that differs to that, and then we have a street layer that differs to that. And if we want to achieve change in the city, changing one building is fairly easy. We can make that building taller. We could make these buildings taller. But that then starts to change the feel of the street. And actually, if we want to build tall, we might want a wider street to make it feel so it suits the character that we're seeking. And you can't do that once that street layer's in. Or take this area here, next to the river. It seems quite underused with all the low-rise buildings in. Well, shall we allow taller buildings? Okay. Well, if we do that, we end up with buildings that are sat right next to each other, and then you can only really have windows in the sides, otherwise they're purely looking into each other. So it doesn't really work for many uses. So what you need to do there is actually clear away all of that. You can't change it by changing one building, and change that layer further down so that you can put something bigger in. Now that will be fairly straightforward. If we move to this situation here, where say we've got obvious connections that are missing, well, to change that, we'd have to take this layer off, to take this layer off, and then we'd have to go back several stages, drop in these connections, and by the time we've done that, they won't have to start to mess all of this layer up and mess all of this layer up. And it's really difficult to do that once all these layers are in place, because essentially once these layers are in place, they can sit there for hundreds of years. So we really have to get those layers right to start with if we want to have a place which has the character that we seek in a city. And before we start looking at trying to make it better by changing that building or polishing the street, we really need to look at, are there any problems with those layers that we need to change? So hopefully now you're thinking layers and thinking even less about buildings.